Welcome everyone, and welcome to the participant and to the speakers of this webinar dedicated to the green to brown ratio. My name is Stéphane Voisin. I am in charge of Institut Le Bachelier of the Sustainable Finance Research Programs and of the specific Foundation PARC, Paris Agreement Research Commons, that has been launched 2 years ago now to basically meet these research challenges. Today's topic is part of a larger research work context at ILB and at PARC, which is really looking at the performance of FI financial institutions in contributing to the transition to a low carbon economy. It's part of a broader work. We had a webinar a few months ago about the second cookbook on alignment cookbook, and this is really a focus on some of the metrics that we find absolutely keys to implement at FI level, but also at analyst level, and to address this topic, we have the context of an article that was published on the ILB website in both French and English last week in French, and I think yesterday's in English. We also have if you come back to the previous slides, please. We also have an article, a specific article, which is coming in the next Revue Banque that will be addressing this topic. And today, to discuss this issue, we have a very nice lineup of speakers, starting with Qingyuan Chong from Institut de la Finance Durable. Qingyuan will introduce herself, but she has a strong academic background, notably recently with the Cage Business School, and she's really an expert in that field. Thank you very much, Qingyuan, to be there for Institut de la Finance Durable, and she will tell us about what the EFD is doing and its agenda on the topic. We have Tanguy de Bienassis, which has been participating to a few of our workshops, and at the IEA is in charge of basically this topic on monitoring the financing flows, the financial flows, to meet the climate goal target and to also meet the IEA scenarios. And Tanguy will tell us about basically the reason why they have developed this specific focus on financing. We have Anderson Lee from the WRI, World Resources Institute, which has been one of the first organizations to provide a specific green to brown ratio. And Anderson will tell us more about basically the methodology behind the ratio they produced and how it's evolving. And Rémi will speak after. Rémi, thank you. You are part of the Reclaim Finance organization, specifically looking at these topics. Reclaim just published, I think yesterday, an important report looking at the performance of FI towards contributing to the low carbon transition, highlighting, I think, almost 60 indicators, and I think it would be interesting to understand better from you how these specific green to brown ratios are taking place in the design of this overall assessment framework from Reclaim. And last but not least, we shall have the pleasure to have one very senior ESG analyst, Felipe Gordillo at Mirova, which has specialized on the banking sectors. And Felipe should basically give us some insight on how this type of ratio fits in their overall assessment framework for the bank sector. So just a few words on the articles, but I think the best things to understand what we think about this ratio is obviously to read the article. Is the context of that article is obviously the research for better KPIs, better metrics to really capture the relevancy, legitimacy, and credibility of the bank's actions towards meeting the Paris Agreement. And also in the context of the recent, let's say, shift at defense level, notably, but also NZBA level, etc., from basically purely emissions target to more financing target. We reckon that financing targets and let's be very clear on that, are still very important. Looking at deep, in-depth analysis of basically the trajectories, because the finance emissions trajectories targets is key, and I think most of the banks that we are speaking to are still committed on that, and it's pretty good news. But taking the words of the G-Friends and other, by on the refocus on rather mobilizing the financing to meet another target, which is not so well defined, because on the obviously the benefit of the finance emission and the emissions target is to get a proper carbon budget to meet and to comply with. It's not so easy to define, what should be the financing budget to meet and to comply with when it comes to greener financing or flying away from fossil fuels. We have some indication from NGFS and from different institutions at the European level. We have some indication from the private sector, McKinsey, the famous trillions to meet every year. But it's not, let's say, as it's a different animal basically than the carbon budget. We are still looking at the right value, and we have probably less scientific expertise on defining this financial values, this financial amount, this financial shift that we need to meet basically the objective of a low carbon economy as decided by the Paris Agreement. So in terms of context, we believe that it's, when it comes to financing and analyzing the financing flows, probably it makes a lot of sense, as we say in the article, as a good diet when it's probably makes sense to not only count the good calories that you eat every day, the natural juice and the fruits and vegetables that you eat, but also if you have an ice cream in the middle of the day, obviously that should be part of the equation, and obviously it's about the same when it comes to measure basically the alignment of financial flows. We have to look at the bad calories and the good calories, and try to make obviously a clear and potentially standardized, to come up with a clear and standardized metrics, and on both sides, what are the bad calories, what are the good calories, to define them as much as we can. And our view is that also potentially to disclose them in the most granular way as possible. Obviously, we like counting dollars and euros because we can aggregate them at a different level, at an institution, financial institution level, at a banking sector level, at a country level, potentially at a global level, to calculate basically as CPI does, for example, a climate policy initiative, to try to gather basically and collect all the information to see how many dollars and euros are mobilized overall. and this is very important. But when it comes to the disclosure and the reporting of single financial institution, I think it would be important in our view, and that's what we defend in this article, to get very granular ratios, possibly by sector. We will today focus on the energy sector with this basically energy supply ratio that was first produced, I think, by Bloomberg Energy Finance, and which is almost becoming a standard in the marketplace. But obviously also in some other type of sectors, expanding that beyond the pure energy sector to the utility sector, to other sectors, or probably Tanguy will argue that utilities can be part of this ratio. This is debatable, and so we could get a specific ratio for oil and gas, another one for utilities. Obviously, it is very important that on the both sides of the equation, on the brown side, on the green side, we have a harmonized scope. So making sure that you, on the green side, you only count for the energy supply related instruments and activities. This is also, the question of homogeneity of, I think, of the is an element of the credibility of the ratio. But obviously, we support the idea also that this ratio could be expanded to other activities, could be expanded from the supply also to the demand side, and this is probably work in progress. We could get other type of ratios really focusing on the demand side. Obviously, when it comes to financial institution, there's a great deal of difference between the what we call the stock of financing and the flows of financing. And can we basically put everything in the same basket? Yes, possibly we can. And maybe a number of you will touch on this issue, but also it could make sense to look at them separately to get a more granular view, which is always good for an analytical point of view. And they have different, obviously, when it comes to stocks and flow, they have different, they're from different natures, they have different impact, certainly on the balance sheet of the financial institutions. There are probably some of them are more liquid than the others. Maybe banks are more attracted to basically dispose their green asset because they have basically an interest to do so. There is a demand in the market. It's probably not the same for the brown side. So our view in this article is let's get as granular as possible when it's possible, but we believe it's possible on a sectorial basis, but also on activity basis, making sure also that we do address the issues of capital market because they do count. I mean, part of the bank efforts is basically to stimulate innovation in financial engineering, sustainable financial engineering, and that's count. And that should be taken into account. And I think it's also a question of looking at rewarding potentially a number of financial institutions for their leadership in that space. So it's not only, I think what we want is certainly the banks not to see this as an additional basically KPI to control them, but really to push them into the right direction. What we are, at least at the LB side, want, we would definitely seeking for endorsement on this type of ratio. We really, this is the first article of a series. We are ready to discuss basically more granularity. We are definitely discussing basically the value of the ratio, what it should be. And I think Tanguy and Rémi will touch upon, what is the right value between brown to green. Is it 1 to 4, 1 to 6, 1 to 10? And I think this has to be considering what you take into account in both sides of the equation. Obviously, the timeline and the scenarios that you take into account. But we believe this is an area for additional research. So there's plenty of things to address, but I think it's about time to leave the floor to the various speakers to get into the details. and provide their views, their different views on this important topic. Starting with Chen-Wan. I hope I pronounce your name well, Chen-Wan.
Yes.
And please tell us more about what the IFD is doing in that space.
Yeah, thank you, Stefan, and thank you for inviting IFD to participate in this webinar. And for the very interesting article and introduction. So we are really happy to join this discussion and the fact that more and more people are actually looking at this ratio. So in fact, we published an overview of the energy transition strategies in the Paris Financial Center in February this year. And actually, one of the best practices that we have identified in that is to monitor such a ratio that compares financing as well as investment in low carbon energies compared to fossil fuels. So this is one of the best practice that we actually kind of identify and want to recommend. So which is why we are actually doing follow-up work on this with the different financial federations in the Parisian Financial Center. So of course, we are actually more looking at the financial center level, so more aggregated, and we are more looking at the financing side. But even if we are more looking at this, we want to make sure that this is a ratio that will be useful for comparing with other countries. So which is why we really look forward to working closely with IEA. So we hope to stick as close as possible to the scope, as Stefan you mentioned, or the different scope, and this to lend credibility to the ratio. So we also want to ensure that when we work on this ratio, we have a scope that is comparable to the other financial center or the other countries and sectors, so that this ratio will be interesting for as many people as possible. So, and finally, of course, we would also like to be able to work closely with ILB to discuss more about all these challenges, as you mentioned, about the stocks as well as the flow of all these investment as well as financing. These are all very important. So I feel that not just the supply side, and we are also interested in looking at the demand side, as you mentioned. So this is also another area that we will be looking at in the following weeks and months. So, and finally, I hope that we can also see more country level data, maybe from the IEA eventually, so that we can actually compare the work from IFD as well as to be able to compare with the data that IEA will publish in the following years. Yeah. So I think that is all. So I hope that for the next round of webinar, we'll be able to share more of the results. So yeah, looking forward to hearing from the other speaker.
Thank you, Chen, and I'm looking forward to this work progressing that you mentioned. I will switch to Tanguy. Tanguy, you represent the standard almost here, because obviously, look, everyone looks at the IES scenario to design their trajectories. When everyone now is moving on the financing, as I mentioned earlier, they are basically looking back at what the IES is doing and providing. So it is quite important to have you here. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Stefan. Thank you for having me. It's great to be here. Yeah, I'll share a couple of slides maybe to explain the work we're doing in this space. Let me tell you one thing before I start. It's hard to be considered as a standard in these times, because things are, all up in the air and moving. Let me. So it can be quite tricky, but I'll try to do my best. So maybe just to start, a quick word about myself and the IEA. So my name is Tanguy de Bianassi, and I'm an energy investment analyst. So at the IEA, our main publication is the World Energy Outlook, and a subset of that is the World Energy Investment Report, and that we are publishing for this year in June. And so I'll speak a little bit about the results of that. Can I just check that you can see my slides before I start? Yeah, perfect. So a few quick words about the IEA before I jump into the more technicalities. So we are an intergovernmental organization that was founded after the oil shocks. Excuse me. And so our main reason to exist is actually energy security, and that's really the key thing that we go by even today. Even if energy security has sort of moved since the 1970s, but that's still our mandate. We are part of the OECD. We have 32 member countries across the world. And what we do at the IEA is to publish energy data, analysis, and outlooks. One last point that I did on this pretty standard slide for this presentation: the IEA is not a regulatory body and has no intention to become one. So when all the data that we publish is for, for information, for as much use as possible, but we're not in a position to regulate any industry, and we're also very tailored towards the energy industry, which, as I'll explain, can make it a bit tricky sometimes when we're trying to move to a new industry like the finance industry, for instance. So our main source of data, the main data that we produce, is included in the World Energy Outlook, and we do two things. We track the latest trends, so the historical trends, and we also project data on various energy indicators, energy, climate, and investment indicators. And in order to project them, we don't do what we call we don't do forecasts. We use scenarios, and many of you will be familiar with this, but I thought it might be a good starting point to share with you the three main scenarios that we use in almost all our publications. Those scenarios, the idea is it's not to forecast, but it's to explore a plausible future for the energy system. So it's really not, the ambition is not to predict what's going to happen, it's to illustrate what might happen under certain conditions. And so we use three scenarios. The stated policy scenario, which take into account the existing policies that are in place or that are about to be implemented around the world, and explore what it means for the energy and the emission system. Then we have the announced pledges scenario that takes into account every pledge that has been made by countries or companies to decarbonize, to achieve net zero in a certain time frame. And here the idea is to take all those pledges at face value, so not to apply any critical thinking on them. It's just to see, if all the pledges from countries and companies and sectors are effectively put in place as they say they will, and are implemented in full and on time. Where does that lead us in terms of the energy system and the greenhouse gas emissions? And the third scenario is the net zero emissions by 2050. This one is a bit different in the sense that it's a normative scenario. That means that we start from the end goal, which is achieving carbon neutrality and keeping global warming below 1.5 with no or limited overshoot. And so there we take the end goal and we do a little retro planning, if you will, of the energy system, and look at what it means again for a variety of indicators. Yeah, those so in those scenarios we track all the energy physical metrics, if you will, but we also track investment, and that's why I'm mainly working in. And so for the second part of this sort of introduction talk, I'm gonna tell you how we track and actually what investment we track, and then it's gonna hopefully clarify how we calculate the ratios. So what we do in our model and our historical tracking, we try to account for the entirety of the energy sector. And so we allocate each category in three main buckets, which will be quite obvious to most of you. But so we look at the supply sector, the power sector, and the demand sector. So if we look at the supply, what we account for there is every investment that goes into the fossil fuel sectors, the oil, gas, and coal, the production, the refining infrastructure. We don't account for investment in the very downstream sector in the oil and gas. We have quite a broad definition of midstream, but we don't go in as far as accounting for downstream. We look also at low emission fuels like hydrogen and bioenergy, direct air capture, methane abatement, and electrification. If we look at the power sector, obviously we're going to look at every side of the power generation, so both from the fossil fuel side, but also everything renewables and low emission, and also quite important for the rest of the discussion, we also do a fairly granular tracking on the investment going into grids and battery storage. If we look at the demand now, the demand is very important to us because when we start building our scenario, we start from the demand. We calculate the total energy demand that will be required in a sort of in the future. And so the demand side for us, for the IEA, is quite important and basically comes first in the actions that need to be taken if we want to stay under in the net zero scenario. And so there, what we're going to be looking at is the green building space, the retrofits, the uptake of efficient appliance and heat pumps. If we look at transport, of course, we're going to look at every aspect of electric mobility, the rail, but also any investment that goes into making international combustion engines more efficient, and fairly similar categories for the industry sector. We also look there at everything that's behind the meter, the solar or geothermal heat. And so I'm saying this because I wanted for you to have a fairly broad overview of what we're tracking. And now if we move on to looking at what we consider clean, by design, we have a fairly broad definition of what we call clean, and that's because we want the message to stay quite simple, actually, in our reports. And so you see here all the categories that are considered clean. We let's say for the headlines of our report, we don't go into the many debates that can be discussed about many of these categories. Like we had, I remember with Remy, we talked about the bioenergy. Is it green? There's some people thinking about nuclear. All the things for us at the IEA, for the simplicity of the messages we're trying to convey, we call them clean, and so that's what we're gonna incorporate in our ratios. We also consider clean, for instance, things like methane abatement in the oil and gas sector, which technically, you could argue that it's putting more gas on the grid, so maybe it's not, it's not that clean. It's cleaner than the baseline is the approach that we're taking. So all you see in green here is what we consider clean energy. We have, if you dig deeper in our publication, we then allocate those in sort of sub bucket where we tell some are clearly clean, others are more contingent to other things being clean in the system. For instance, if you look at grids, we consider grids to be clean because they are a necessary enabler to any adoption of renewables. That assumption, of course, can be true in some countries. In others, where you have an electricity mix that is based on coal, is the grid clean? That can be up for debate. But for the sake of our report, we consider that it's necessary for more renewables, so it's clean. So I just want, if we translate this into the investment numbers, so here on the slide and going into the conversation about the ratios, you can see that we went from a ratio that was in favor of fossil fuels back 10 years back in time in 2015, where we had, I think it was 1.3, but 1.3 ratio in favor of fossil fuels, to now where we have an energy investment that totals about $3 trillion annually, and where clean energy is about 2 trillion and fossil fuels is about 1 trillion. So we have, right now, we have a ratio of 1 to 2. That ratio for us, again, includes demand, because again, we think it's pretty important to take into account investment in demand. I forgot also to mention on this slide that for us, the investment that goes into demand is only the incremental spending that is required to make an energy use more efficient. So for instance, if let's say if you buy an electric car, we're not going to count the full price of the EV. We're going to count like the additional price that is required compared to an equivalent internal combustion engine. If that price becomes at par or negative, then we zero it out. That means that there's no need for incremental investment in that space. So we have this 1 to 2 right now, and those are the last year's number. We're in the process of updating it, so we will share an update as part of our new publications. So if we translate this into what we see in terms of the fossil fuel, the clean to fossil fuel ratios, we're at 1 to 2 today in our STEP scenario, and if we project to 2035 in the steps, so in the current policies, and again the step will likely be heavily updated for the next iteration of the World Energy Outlook. So those are last year's number, but last year, so we anticipated a ratio that would become 1 to 3.5 in 2035. So that means for each dollar spent in fossil fuels, you have 3.5 spent on clean energy. In the APS, it's 1.1, it's 1 to 8, and in the NZE, it's 1 to 20 in 2035. So 1 to 10 is more related to 2030. We're starting to get very close to 2030, so we chose to extend that deadline a little bit to 2035. I quickly, while we were during the introduction, I quickly introduced on the side, the numbers that you can see is the supply ratio, so that the ratio between just supply and power, which I think corresponds to the methodology discussed in the article. So you see that net zero is at 1 to 12, 1 to 5 for APS, and 1 to 3.5 for steps. Very quickly, wrapping up, the use case and the limitations of those ratios. Those ratios at the IEA, they were developed a bit, I would say, not by accident, but as a result of our tracking investments, because what we were asked to do by our government constituencies was really to start tracking investment and understanding the financing that was going into the energy sector. And so we think they're a useful tool, and the metric is quite easy to grasp, obviously. However, and I'm sure we're going to discuss this in the rest of this webinar, the consensus on what can be labeled green, what can be included in the ratio is up for debate. We also have, as Stéphane, you highlighted, this issue where for us, we can only look at CapEx, and so primary financing. And so there's a whole story that we're missing on the finance emissions and the secondary market transactions. And perhaps the hardest for us is that we are updating our scenarios significantly every year. They tend to move, and we get the feedback from banks and others that is very difficult for them to use our data to position themselves, because those sort of metric can become like a moving targets, and they can change, and it's hard to devise a policy on something that's moving. So for ratios tend not to move that much, but you have, like, if you go down by sectors or by country, there you can see more movement, and it can become quite difficult. And just maybe to finish on that note, we're trying to make more granular data available. I'm not sure we're going to have data at each country level anytime soon, but we're trying. And also to say that the current geopolitical context makes we sort of have to update the results from the scenario, and maybe use new scenarios as well. And so it can be quite tricky to provide the consistent data across the years, and that is on the same parameter. I think with this, I'm happy to wrap up. And Stéphane, I don't know, give the floor back to you.
Thank you, Remy. Thank you, Tanguy. Exactly right on schedule. And thank you for this very comprehensive presentation. And I'm sure, yes, indeed, we will address later some elements of the debate that you did not address. That's for sure. But to move on, I would like to pass the floor to Anderson to tell us how WRI basically is using the IEA work basically to produce and design their own ratio. Anderson, if you can tell us more about that. And just, I didn't leave you, the audience, an opportunity yet. I won't leave you any opportunity yet to ask questions. We'll do that after the last speaker presentation, but you can send your questions through the chat if you want, or you can basically leave it to the end and we will take them. Thank you. Anderson?
Thank you, Stéphane. Just to check, everyone can see my screen?
Indeed, thank you.
All right, thank you. Yeah, very interesting introductions and conversations and presentation for both Stéphane and IEA and Chang. The question in terms of the supply, demand, the granularity of data, the harmonization of data, those are definitely themes and challenges that we encountered when we developed our weight to fossil fuel ratio, and we'll talk about a little bit of that experience. So basically, it will be a quick presentation in terms of just providing a little bit of a context of how we developed the work for the Financial Institutions Net Zero Tracker. So tracking banks in terms of how they're doing about net zero, talk a little bit about the framework and indicators, and then dive into one of the indicators that we have in our assessment framework, which is the ratio, and then share some of the leading and lagging practices that we encountered and how to make the industry become a little bit better. So for the tracker, our sample is 25 banks, and those banks have been adjusted to include the largest banks by asset size, but also add a little bit of more geographical diversity, include smaller banks, but have coming from different parts of the world. So we include systematically important banks, the GSIBs. We include banks from 10 countries, and we also include banks that are on the smaller size, but they have been prominent voices and providing leading practices in the banking industry. So you can see here a little bit of the sample that we include in our analysis. For the framework and indicators, we have basically 4 themes across and 15 indicators or so. And the 4 themes are transparency and ambition, implementation, credibility, and nature and equity. In terms of the green versus fossil fuel finance ratio, it is under implementation. So under the implementation side, we want to see how banks are acting on their net zero commitments. So the emissions targets and emissions data is under transparency and ambition, and then the ratio is under here. So we'll be focusing on the ratio. So the idea of our tracker was to track the banks and how they are doing, but only using publicly available information. So either the data is reported by the banks themselves, or it's available publicly by many of the research organizations that are looking at the space. So for green finance data that is publicly reported, they mostly come from the banks. I think our industry, our peer organizations are now looking into the green financing side by banks, but still the data comes from the banks themselves. And often when they disclose the information, it is quite vague in terms of descriptions without details. So they will use terms like low carbon transition or the green economy. So you can't really tell what is included there. It is the supply side only. Is the demand? What do they define as low carbon or green? So usually the case is a vague description, but sometimes they provide details. And when they provide details, It can include both the supply and demand side of clean energy. So they put data on sustainable transportation or making buildings more efficient, green buildings. So they'll be looking at the demand side, as explained by our previous speaker. They also include other sustainability criteria such as water conservation, circular economy. Those are all really good causes and places to make investments, but it gets a little bit hard to compare them when the other side of the equation is more on the energy side. And then they also include various financing instruments. So both on the primary financing, but also secondary financing, secondary markets, capital markets, but also derivatives. Sometimes they also include investments. So not exactly on the financing lending, but also on the stock of investments. So that is an overview, a snapshot of how green finance is reported. On the fossil fuel finance side, it is the opposite dilemma. So banks, they don't report the fossil fuel finance usually. So most of the banks in our sample, that part of the equation is unknown. So we then have to rely on other publicly available information. And the Banking on Climate Chaos, it is one of the most reliable sources tracking historically of how banks have provided financing to the fossil fuel sector. So combining these two data sets, we calculated the ratio, and you can already see some of the challenges and limitations of this methodology. So the first one, we are doing different data sets. So the y-axis here, green finance, it is coming from the banks. The x-axis is coming from Banking on Climate Chaos. And this creates challenges in terms of both of the scope of the financing instruments and also the scope of the green technologies. So what ends up happening is that we are likely overestimating the bank's ratio under this methodology. So for example, in financing instruments, what banks include under their green finance definition is the definition is bigger than what is included by Banking on Climate Chaos. So Banking on Climate Chaos includes more on the corporate lending, primary lending. Banks include consumer finance, capital markets, derivatives, trading, and so on. Similarly, on green technologies, Banking on Climate Chaos looks more on the supply of fossil fuel, while on the green side, the most include green and supply and demand. So while we are still overestimating the bank's ratios, the average is still below the 10-to-1 ratio that comes from the IEA by 2030. So we use 10-to-1 or 1-to-10 because we are including both the supply and demand side under the green finance. So here you can see the average of the sample. Here is the 10-to-1 ratio. So banks that are closer to this line, the steeper line, or to the left of the line, they have a higher ratio than 10-to-1. So just a few of the banks from our sample. The size of the bubble means the size of the bank. And here you'll see that we have some banks that are in a darker green. The darker green means how much of information that we can select and filter that to meet the IEA categories for clean energy. So as I mentioned before, some banks include many different criteria and categories like circular economy, but the banks in dark green, they provide enough granularity, not ideal, but a little bit, that you can filter out and use the categories that meet the IEA definition. So clean energy, energy efficiency, green buildings, renewable energy, sustainable transportation, in the case for Citibank. So making those adjustments, it's possible to have a more apples-to-apples comparison with the IEA definition. So the light green banks are the ones that the data is not possible to adjust, so it is unadjusted at a face value. The dark greens, it is possible to adjust. When you adjust, the ratio goes even lower. So here, Citigroup adjusted ratio is less than 1.3 to 1, so it's around 1 to 1. But if you were to just take the face value information, it will be 1.8 to 1. So this speaks to the issue of lack of disclosure and the need for granularity. So the idea here is to push the banks to disclose more information. So the light greens become dark green, so analysts can adjust the information and make an adjusted analysis of how their financing is working. The last slide. So here on our tracker, one of our core audiences are the banks themselves, the sustainability teams. So we want to showcase good practices or leading practices that are happening across the peers, across the industry, so they can learn from each other. So here we show examples of banks that are providing more disclosures, more refined information, and banks can learn from them. So the aim is to look for more consistent apples to apples comparison. So for example, here, the example from Citi, you can see here on the right, where they provide the criterias in a more granular level. TD Bank provides the criterias, but also the line of business. So here you can make a rather assessment in terms of, is it primary financing, is it secondary markets, etc., and HSBC and others. So yeah, this was a little bit of our experience of how we tackled the issue of creating a ratio from the data that is available out there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anderson. That was for really opening up and be transparent on your methodology. I'm sure there will be some question afterwards. Next speaker is Remy, and I'm sure Remy will open the debate on a number of issues that have been addressed. Now, as I said earlier, Reclaim just published an important report yesterday, and revealing basically the assessment of a number of banks according to, I think, 60 criteria. Is that right? And I think it's important to understand what is the place of this ratio in the overall assessment framework of Reclaims, and what are your recommendations?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. We don't have your slides yet.
That's because I don't have any. Sorry about that.
Okay, good.
So thank you very much for having me, and thank you to everyone that talked before me. It was really, really interesting. Maybe to finish and conclude the long list of speakers, I can start by a few words about Reclaim Finance, and then maybe emphasize why we consider that this discussion that we are having, and we should all be having in the financial sphere around the energy supply financing ratio really matters. So historically, our mission at Reclaim Finance is to make finance work for climate through research, analysis, and advocacy activities. Traditionally, we've focused on ending support to fossil fuel expansion, which is a critical step for achieving carbon neutrality by 2050, of course, and is highlighted in the IEA scenario, in the NZE scenario since 2021, actually. However, though it is essential, getting fossil fuel financing alone is not enough to ensure a rapid and just energy transition. We need a complete transformation of our energy supply system, replacing fossil fuel with sustainable alternatives, not just adding more renewables on top of more fossil fuel to effectively reduce greenhouse gas emissions. This is why Reclaim Finance published in 2024 the Sustainable Power Policy Tracker, which track, analyzes, and assess top banks' commitments to support the energy transition of the power sector, and it's based both on their financing targets in favor of sustainable power supply and commitments to restrain financing support to fossil fuel power expansion. And this methodology includes the energy supply financing ratio. I just wanted to build on what Tanguy said earlier, on the fact that the NZE scenario gives us a clear roadmap of the investment trends that we need to follow if we are to achieve carbon neutrality. We need basically two things. One is triple the global installed capacity of renewables to achieve 11,000 gigawatts of installed capacity by 2030. This is the main factor in the decline of fossil fuel demand, and thus to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions as we electrify our economies. And to make this happen, annual investments in renewable power, grids, and batteries need to double by 2030. And 2, we need to cut annual investment in the fossil fuel sector by 60% by 2030 and by 75% by 2035. So to sum it up, the IEA explicit this 6-to-1 ratio for energy supply investment, which concretely means that by 2030, every dollar allocated in investment for fossil fuel must be outmatched by $6 in the alternative. This ratio of 6-to-1 can and should guide financial actors who genuinely want to support the energy transition. And we think this is particularly the case for private banks. As capital providers, they are key players here. Through sectoral policies in particular, they can choose to restrain or facilitate the access to their financing products and services to specific sectors. Hence, they can slow down or speed up this transformation that is required. Right now, as many of you might have noticed, this ratio is gaining in momentum. In the financial world over the last 12 months, several leading organizations have published on it, including Institut Louis Bachelier, but not alone. In 2024, I'd say, as Anderson just explained, the World Resource Institute took a look at this ratio in their net zero tracker, which was really enlightening. And the SBTI as well recommended it as a target for financial actors, explicitly citing the 6-to-1 target. In January, Bloomberg that was cited also earlier, released their third report on the energy supply banking ratio. And even regulators now are on board because the European Banking Authority included this ratio in their ESG risk guidelines that they published in January this year. So based on that, we are already seeing major financial institutions adopting this ratio. For example, you might have seen that the New York City Comptroller pushed last year and this year even more biggest North American banks to publish this very ratio. JP Morgan did so in December. Citi and Royal Bank of Canada have committed to do so this year. And across the Atlantic, we've seen Santander, Crédit Agricole, and BNP Paribas also publishing their ratio. So this could look good, but the problem is each of those banks used a different methodology, actually. So none of them can be qualified as robust. None of them can be compared to the IEA or among each other. So this is where the recent publication of the Institut Louis Bachelier comes in very useful. It provides a robust methodological framework and an external one that can help standardize these ratios. It can assist banks that were reluctant to create their own methodology, and those that already took a first step and now need to reinforce their ratio to ensure that it reflects a credible climate strategy. There are 3 major key points in the methodology of the Institut Louis Bachelier that I'd like to highlight in particular because I think they are critical for a ratio to be considered as robust. One, it should consider all financing, including bond issuance. Stefan underlined it in the introduction. A ratio that only considers loan overlook capital market activities, which represent a significant share of fossil fuel financing. According to the Banking on Climate Chaos, it was more than 40% of the financing to the fossil fuel activity that was provided by banks through capital market activities. So it's a big share. And also banks should do so in an annualized flow approach, which would allow comparison with the annual investment trends that are detailed in the NZD scenario of the IEA. So this is the first point. 2, a robust ratio should cover the entire value chain of fossil fuels. A credible ratio should not be limited to only upstream activities, for instance, or partially cover downstream activities. It's essential that it captures the entire value chain of fossil fuel. And 3, the last point, I'd say it is even more important that banks apply a rigorous and ambitious approach to the scope of sustainable alternatives that they include as solutions in the ratio. On the one hand, this scope should exclude false solution, and this is a point where we can have debate. I see you smiling, Tanguy. We consider that this scope should exclude notably bioenergy and technologies that relies on fossil fuel and extend their use. This is particularly the case of fossil power plants with carbon capture and storage or hydrogen produced through fossil gas. On the other hand, the scope should include flexibility infrastructures that are key to the deployment of sustainable power and priority solar and wind. And this is particularly the case of power grids and their modernization, and as well as battery storage. So those are the three main points I wanted to underline that are really key and are presented in the article. So to conclude, I'd say from our perspective, until now, the lack of a clear and independent methodology has been both a barrier and a risk in our discussions from what we understood from the banks. On the one side, a barrier holding back banks that don't want to create their own methodology, and a risk to see a proliferation of incomparable ratios. This publication of the Institut Louis Bachelier tackles these two quite adequately and provides a robust tool for banks willing to actually demonstrate credibility in their climate strategy. And we strongly encourage banks to adopt specific financing policies and targets dedicated to the power sector, and those should at least include this ratio without delay. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Remy, and thank you for your nice comments on the paper. We are totally on the same page when it comes to some standardization needs. This is, I think, a very important topic, and I think also Anderson has highlighted the limit of this heterogeneity framework and ecosystem. Let's move to, as I said earlier, Felipe, last but not least, we need a bank analyst, an ESG bank analyst, on a very senior one, to tell us a bit what's a buy-side perspective on this. And basically, Felipe, what we'd like to get from you is really how do you read this, and how this specific ratio or family of ratio are fitting into your basically overall assessment framework of the bank's performance in the contribution to the sustainable and the low carbon economy. The floor is yours, Felipe.
Thank you, Stefan, and hi everyone, and thank you very much for the very senior analyst. It's a pleasure. So thank you for that, and I think the paper is very interesting because it aims to set a standard to assess climate action from financial institutions, and that definitely is a very positive development. Then I just wanted to follow up on what Anderson said previously, because I totally agree with him in the fact that there is a multiplicity of disclosures from financial institutions. You have, BNP Paribas that commits to mobilize more than 250 billion euros up to 2025. Then you have Deutsche Bank that says something very similar. And then when it comes to trying to give sense to those commitments, the situation becomes very challenging, of course, because there is a lack of definition on, when a bank is pushing for a narrative about sustainable finance, what is the meaning of sustainable finance? What type of technologies are we talking about? What type of financial instruments are we discussing? So I think that the paper, it brings more clarity to that debate. And of course, as Remy was mentioning, I think the value is to set a standard that can be used by several financial institutions and stops, the multiplicity of, the different methodologies in the market. So when it comes to what we do at Mirova for the financial sector and the way we assess banks, we basically have, the overall approach is to ask the question, how a financial institution is actually contributing to the realization of SDGs. So you have social SDGs, you have environmental SDGs. So you have a multiplicity of ways to actually trigger an eligibility. It's not only about climate. You could also have, an eligibility that is triggered via the contribution to social aspects. Then when it comes to the particular topic of capital, green capital or sustainable capital mobilization, what we do at the moment is we do a qualitative assessment based on commitments, based on the credibility of those institutions. But again, we lack a bit of instruments to actually assess quantitatively those commitments. So again, the developments of this paper are very welcome. At some point, we're very, how can I put it, optimistic about the development of the GAR, the Green Asset Ratio, because, we're talking about standardization, same definition, We're talking about, the type of instruments that are allowed to calculate the ratio. Same rules apply to every financial institution, of course, European financial institutions, so that narrows the scope. But we're very positive about that. Then when we start to see the first disclosures around GAR, and of course GAR, it takes into account not only primary energy, but also the consumption of energy, and in particular, there is a lot of green buildings, and in particular, green mortgages linked to those green asset ratio. We actually were a bit disappointed about the levels of disclosure. When you look at the median level for the GAR at flow level, that's research provided by ABN AMRO, the median level is of 4% for European banks. And if you look at the GAR at stock level, that ratio is even lower than 1%. So it's very low percentages. And again, it's for us, it's difficult to assess that information because of the low level of impact. In our framework, a company to be eligible because of their revenues or assets, they need to prove at least 10% of positive contribution. So if we use GAR, there is very, very few banks that are eligible. Again, so my message here is that we definitely will like the development of this indicator. We, of course, have some comments about the information shared in the paper. One very easy comment to make is you have, on one side, you have the finance flow, then you have the facilitated flows, which we like. But then you also mentioned in that paper, the idea is to aggregate that information. So when you aggregate, my question is, how do you aggregate to control any possible bias against, for example, banks that are heavily involved in the retail business, which will be more exposed to green finance flows? And in the opposite, you have the case of banks that have a more business model focus in corporate and investment banking, which by definition will be more exposed to facilitated green flows. And then again, the problem with that, to be fair with them, is, as you mentioned in the paper, facilitated flows are very depending on market conditions. So if you have a year in which, let's say this year, in which, the primary market for bonds is affected by, the volatility coming from the US, then you will see those levels to shrink. Again, that's an important point to address, in my point of view, to introduce some kind of fairness between the different business models of banks. Again, retail with the finance flows and CIB business with the facilitated flows. Then my second point or comment is about, and I found very interesting in that paper, and it's a comment that is linked to a paper published by, I think it's Share Action, in which they basically say, look, we see that there is a disconnection between, the decarbonization targets on one side and the green finance or sustainable finance mobilization targets in the other side. And Share Action says, we'd like to see kind of a coherence between the two types of information. And then, Reina, and I totally agree with that point. And often when we engage with banks, they simply don't have that information. When we ask, okay, if you are committing 200 billion euros for sustainable finance for the next 5-10 years, what will be the effect in terms of reducing carbon emissions? And often they don't produce that information. So I think that's something that it's important in the paper. But when you assess the carbon emissions for banks, the most important aspect, of course, is scope 3. So what happens in the loan book? So I was like, okay, it's very nice to have a ratio, energy ratio for finance flows. Very nice to have one for facilitated flows. Then you have the aggregated KPI. But then if you want to make the connection with the scope 3 emissions, maybe you need to have also an indicator to what happens at the loan book or stock or the stock of those loans. So I think that's something to think about. So again, very happy to comment on this paper. It's very, very positive, this development. As my fellow panelists mentioned it before, it's an important effort to support standardization and to have a more clear view on what financial institutions are doing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Felipe, for this amazing views and comments. Thank you for commenting on the paper as well. That was basically not the only idea, but we totally agree on you. I mean, we do recommend a ratio specifically on the stock, and I do take your point on that. I would like to first of all, before we take some questions, and I don't see any in the chat, and so maybe Feriel and Anita, if there are some, you can highlight them to us. But I would like to give you each of you a chance to react to the different panelists in this discussion. I'm sure Remy or Tanguy, you have some or Anderson, whoever wants to go first. And then, if you don't have comments, maybe I'll ask you questions to Tanguy first. Felipe touched upon, the share action argument of a lack of connectivity between basically the financing target and the emissions target. And actually, I think share action says in their report that sometimes we have the impression that the different teams don't speak to each other. And this is actually a fascinating comment. Do you think that the IEA actually could play a role by basically coming back to the benchmark? If obviously you're setting the benchmark when it comes to the trajectory. Everyone set their trajectory according to most of the time to your scenario, even if they do some downscaling at the end, and now they could do exactly the same thing on the financing target. So could you be an element or a solution for more coherence and consistency between the emission side and the financing side?
Yeah, we could. I guess we could try. We tried to do this, for instance, in the oil and gas sector, where we published a scope 1 and 2 report. Where we're trying to. And I think I saw a question actually on this popping, but it seemed to have disappeared. But on the sort of the emission intensity, and there's something we could do here to render those emission intensities more explicit and tie them to the financing. I think there's something that could be done there. We're quite a small organization, unfortunately, and so we would need more resources. But I think that's definitely something we can look at. Maybe also to react maybe to something Remy has said on the bond side, for instance. And maybe I don't know, maybe it would trigger some debate, but when I look at the oil and gas industry right now, how it's financed, it relies quite, especially in the US, very little on debt. And you can see all those buybacks and those dividends returns. And so for us, it's not the first angle that should be targeted, the debt side per se. And so yeah, but that's just a parenthesis to say. But again, it's a bit tricky to look at emission intensity, and I'm saying this because we get the questions by email every day. Like the emission intensity of the results of our modeling and of our scenarios tend to vary every year. And so depending on what you want to look at, in the net zero, for instance, you're looking for the final objective. So every year that you delay action, every year that you have more coal power on the grid, then the emission intensity that you need to attain in 2030 is going to be much lower for the clean part if you want to still achieve the objective. And so that's something we're trying to grapple with, and that we haven't found the solution to be honest.
Okay, there's no more questions. So I think you gave me a very good idea for a question to both Remy and Anderson. It's basically in your assessment framework, how can you find solution to reduce basically the volatility that Tanguy was saying that can be due to swings in energy pricing or swing in the market pricing. I mean, Felipe touched upon the volatility of the flow according to market conditions. Can you mitigate this volatility effect in your assessment? Whoever wants to start first.
I can start and provide some quick thoughts. Yeah, I think that's a big challenge and important question. I think at some point you have to rely on the party that has closest primary data. So the banks, they know better their loan book, their financing flows. So they have that more raw data, granular data, and then they can provide basically an attribution analysis. So they say our emissions or our financing grew or decreased by X% or Y%, and the reasons were, and then they can say, okay, 50% of the change was because of market conditions, and etc. Some banks have done that kind of attribution analysis. I think Deutsche Bank did in terms of how their emissions change, and then you can see the emissions change because the market value of the companies or the oil companies changed. So I think we have to, in some way, rely on the banks or the financial institutions that have the closest access to granular data, where they can do that kind of assessment.
Thank you, Remy.
Well, I don't want to repeat Anderson, but maybe I can add that maybe decarbonization targets basically are not sufficient alone to provide a climate strategy. And we consider that those targets should be complemented by other targets regarding actually what banks do, which is provide financing. So it's quite odd to see that some banks are considering that decarbonization targets in intensity are sufficient to provide a strategy at their level, and they are not at all addressing what is their core business and providing financing. So maybe to like complement this this very hard to mitigate volatility, it could be a way for banks to like address their financial flows and the financial services and products that they allocate to the key sectors through their sectoral politics, and in particular for the key sectors that they are already addressing actually in their intensity targets. They are already publishing targets for oil and gas, for power, for steel, for automotive. So maybe complement those targets with financial targets could be a way.
You made that point very, very clear, but my question is, within the financing elements, the financing reporting, you do have basically swings, which are due to volatility in pricing and market condition, etc. So specifically on the financing ratios, are you looking at options basically to reduce this implied volatility, I would say?
To be very honest, that's a good point. I don't have something to say in addition to that. I'd have to give some thoughts, but point taken.
So we have the ground for new research, a new paper.
Yep.
This is excellent. I think we have I could take few takeaways and transform a few lessons into some research ideas, probably. I don't see any questions from the audience. Probably is a good proof that you've been crystal clear in your presentation. Let's hope. And my last word is to thank you all. Unless there is a final comment from any of you, you have 1 minute to make a comment. Otherwise, at least I give you the floor, and I thank you all for attending this event. Any comment, Felipe? You can go ahead, really.
Maybe I have a comment on I saw one of the slides from Anderson, and those banks that are in the 10-to-1 ratio. I think I saw that on top of that there were 3 Chinese banks. Maybe I'm wrong, but I have the impression that the top 3 were Chinese banks. I think, in my point of view, is very interesting outcome because, you know, the financial sector, they basically support the real economy. So if you have a position in which you say you go and see a bank, you know, not a AAA, but let's say a almost AAA bank, and then you go to tell them you should decarbonize, you should sacrifice profitability, you should move away from the oil and gas sector. That's a very nice thing to say, but it may not reflect the economic priorities of that financial institution. So I think that, you know, from that slide, I think it's very interesting because, you know, what China is telling us is that if you want to be serious about, you know, an ecological and a climate transition, you need industrial policy. And if you have industrial policy as a condition, as a necessary condition, then I think that the financial sector will follow. And I think that that's something that maybe, that's my opinion, that maybe it's something that is missing in the debate right now in Europe. I'm moving away from, you know, the classical point of view. You should do that because that's the nice thing to do. Maybe we should move the narrative. You should do that because it's the profitable thing to do.
It's a very nice comments, like all your comments, and actually it makes me think that we will have another webinar on the 14th of May together with the OECDs, providing actually a guideline on the policies and looking also at these issues on a more broader view, basically looking at a consolidated alignment. Don't miss this one. You can find it on the ILB website. But I think it's time for me to thank you all. We're looking forward to the future work of the IFD in that space, and the new report of the IEA that should come anytime soon, no, Tanguy? Or
well, we always have a constant stream of reports, but the investment one is coming on the 3rd of June.
3rd of June. Okay, yeah. Thank you. That's a scoop. Thank you very much, all of you, and have a very good night. See you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye.